Great. Thank you so much, Jack, for having me. It's a great honor, especially to get to speak at an event that is in honor of Rachel Carson, who really gave birth to the modern environmental sciences movement and has inspired a great many of us. It's a pleasure to get a chance to share with you some thoughts about how innovations within agri-food systems can help us to boost human and environmental resilience to shocks. So I am, as Jack said, I am an agricultural and development economist. So I'm necessarily going to approach this from a perspective of that of somebody concerned primarily about the humans, but humans nested deeply within a global system that is deeply coupled to the natural environment. And one of the most important things we need to recognize about the broader environment over the past generation or so is that a variety of different risks have been rising in frequency and severity. So there are lots of ways one can document this. I just noticed just before signing on that the latest issue of Nature has a nice paper that summarizes exposure to tropical cyclones, documenting how poor populations around the world are much more frequently and severely exposed to cyclones, a very damaging weather event than are those of us who are wealthier. But we see in a range of data more frequent extreme disasters as depicted in the graphic on the left, both the upper one on mega disasters and their frequency, as well as recorded natural disasters on the lower left. We see this in markets. In the upper right, I plot the time series of real average food prices from the FAO over time. And you see that not only has the average price been increasing in inflation adjusted terms, but the volatility of price has essentially tripled since the 1990s. Markets are considerably more volatile. There's a very close coupling between food security stress and socio-political stability, bidirectional. Conflict obviously causes hunger and food insecurity and places suffering violence. What's less well appreciated is how food insecurity itself sows the seeds of violence and gives rise to unrest in a range of countries. I described some of that work in an edited volume from about a decade ago. And somewhat sensationally, but one of my favorite magazine covers depicting this came from The Economist a little less than 2 years ago, where you see this very striking title, The Coming Food Catastrophe, with what looks like grains of wheat, but when you look closely, they're human skulls. The point here being that the world is suffering from rising risk, and we need to build resilience to that risk. And understanding resilience is a bit tricky. Basically, the way most of us think about risk is that risk is something exogenous to people. And shocks like weather shocks are exogenous to each of us individually, but they're certainly the product of our collective behavior. Climate change, most importantly, is very clearly a product of anthropogenic forcing that collective human behavior is causing this. But resistance to and ability to bounce back from those risks, or the ability to absorb or quickly recover from shocks, is really important. And it is most important for the poor. We might not worry so much about whether Bill Gates or Elon Musk lose 15% of their wealth in a market shock to a business that they own. They might suffer a serious loss, but they're not suffering a loss that drives them to the point where one should normatively be deeply concerned about their well-being. It's qualitatively different when we think about people who are hovering near the threshold of a reasonable living standard, or worse yet, hovering near the threshold of absolute survival, where in the absence of intervention, they are quite likely to perish. That's what happens in famines. So the literature in development economics on poverty traps has taken this quite seriously over the last, say, 20 years, as we have come to understand poverty traps increasingly as arising because of uninsured risk exposure, because bad things happen and can come from any of several directions. It could be droughts, it could be floods, it could be disease. The political scientist Anirudh Krishna has this wonderful book, One Illness Away, where he documents across a range of societies using replicated survey methods of recall how the thing that drives most people who are presently poor into poverty was an illness shock, a health shock in the household. Others, like I'll talk about shortly, drought shocks can be catastrophic, or violence shocks can be catastrophic. But the basic idea here is that catastrophic risk exposure can drive people into abject states of poverty or wind up leading to excess mortality. My colleague Mark Consis and I try to summarize some of these thoughts in developing a theory of resilience as it applies to international development, to development in humanitarian programming in a PNAS paper a decade ago. This graphic, which I won't take time to explain, comes from that. But those who are interested in thinking about how does poverty and resilience to shocks, how do those intersect? I encourage you go read that paper, and we could chat offline about it. But more broadly, the literature on persistent poverty, on people falling into poverty traps where their behaviors then merely reinforce their initial condition. This is very closely related to resilience to shocks. And this is especially true in rural areas where the natural environment is similarly subject to shocks. Buzz Holling and others years ago began to describe resilience in ecological terms as the existence of multiple stable states, where you can have a state of a lake that's in pristine conditions. A bad chemical spill can kill off both flora and fauna, completely change the interactions within that lake ecosystem, and drive it into a permanently degraded state. Or deforestation can do the same thing in forest ecology. When we recognize that rural populations are deeply linked to the natural environment that is itself subject to multiple stable states, we have this sort of multidimensional resilience problem, that the natural environment is vulnerable to shocks just like people are. And that's true in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, forests, soils, disease ecology. And the feedback here is really important. So one example, whoops, excuse me, I didn't mean to hit that advance. One example on the left relates to the emergence of new infectious diseases in humans. My collaborator, Jason Rohr, the chair of biology at Notre Dame, has done really important work trying to track where do infectious diseases originate. He's a parasitologist. And it turns out that agriculture is the main source of emergent infectious disease in humans, especially of zoonoses, the diseases that cross species boundaries. Think of Ebola, think of swine flu or avian flu, possibly think COVID. There's a reasonable theory that that originated in wet markets that cause transmission. And these problems are not just in disease ecology that originates from the human-wildlife interface and the human-livestock-wildlife interface. It originates as well from water, where agriculture is by far the main use of fresh water in the world, especially in the low-income developing countries of Africa and Asia, where the vast majority of future population growth is happening and where virtually all future growth in demand for food will occur. And there's this bidirectional feedback that anthropogenic climate change in turn changes agriculture and changes agriculture's impacts on the natural environment. So this very closely coupled system with, because I'm speaking to the Michigan State audience, with telecoupling, that the impacts of driving SUVs in North America are manifest in rangelands degradation in Mongolia, as some students and I demonstrate in a manuscript we're just trying to finish publishing now. There are these very tight connections that are often difficult to see until you unpack the data carefully. But the point being that this rising pattern of shocks is partly the endogenous byproduct of human behavior and impacts both the natural environment and the human environment. And I'm going to argue that the most central thing we need to do to build resilience to shocks, to reduce the severity and frequency, and to enhance our ability to absorb those shocks or to recover quickly from those shocks, especially in ways that prevent catastrophic losses among vulnerable populations, is agri-food systems transformation. The agri-food system is the only economic sector in the world that touches every human every day. Everybody eats. It absorbs a plurality of working people in the world, and it has these very deep connections to natural environments. So the agri-food system really is the common denominator to today's polycrises of market crises, rising food insecurity, climate change, air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity loss, all these different crises all come back to agri-food systems use, how we manage the natural environment to feed ourselves and our families. It's not easy to transform agri-food systems, but it can be done. And we know this in part from history. Roughly 100 years ago, the world looked fairly similar. We had come out of one world war. We were about to go into another world war. We had these absolute environmental catastrophes, the Dust Bowl in the prairies of Canada and the Great Plains of the US being the North American manifestation of that. We were seeing mass famine in a variety of places. People were deeply worried about population growth. There was stagnation in crop productivity. There were lots of parallels to today. But through what I like to term a doubly progressive strategy, meaning bank on progress through science, trust the science to be able to enable us to progress in our relationship with the natural environment, our ability to take care of ourselves and others and the world that supports us, as well as progressive in the sense of solidarity with the poor, taking seriously the need to protect most of all the most vulnerable to environmental degradation. And we need to resurrect that strategy. We saw that in the 1930s, 40s, there was this dramatic uptake of, for example, hybrid maize, which is just one of several things you could point to. Derek Byerly has a very nice article that has this graphic on the lower left showing this very rapid diffusion of hybrid maize, hybrid corn in the United States between 1930 and 1950. And you see that corn yields had essentially been stable from the Civil War until we hit an inflection point. After that, we've seen very steady, oscillatory, but steady growth in maize productivity in North America and around the world as the progress in the US diffused elsewhere. But we also saw things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, public works programs that put the unemployed to work in reinforcing and protecting the natural environment and protecting soils and watersheds so that they could sustain higher rates of productivity and productivity growth. And we saw things like the Green Revolution, where different crop varieties, different varieties of rice, as depicted on the right, were crossed to create these very high yielding semi-dwarf varieties like IR8 and its subsequent progeny. So a group of us articulated this vision of agri-food systems transformation in an open access book. So this is available free of charge. This was the 2020 Nature Sustainability's expert panel. Every year, Nature Sustainability convenes an expert panel around a topic. That year, it was set out to be innovations in agri-food systems for the very reason I've explained. And the vision we articulate there is that we can do this. We know from past history, we can transform agri-food systems. But the crucial thing is to keep in mind what is the objective. And maybe the most important thing that has to change for those of us in the scientific community and at educational institutions is the perspective of we're trying to grow crop yields, output per unit area cultivated, and we're trying to grow the supply of calories. That was very much the target back in the 1960s, 1950s, when we were starting the last major agri-food systems transformation. But we know a lot more today, and we're hitting planetary boundaries that weren't binding back then. So today, what we need is really what the group of authors refers to as a HERS agri-food system transformation: healthy, equitable, resilient, and sustainable. We need total factor productivity growth. That's what TFP in the slide stands for. So meaning total output divided by all the inputs. We need total factor productivity growth to recover. It has been slowing over the last couple of decades, but it has to be sustainable. It has to be based off of environmental conservation, protecting the soils and water and air and climate on which future agricultural productivity depends. And it requires inducing demand shift by the 8+ billion people a day who choose foods. So there are ways to do this, but there aren't magic bullet solutions. One of the central themes of that book, and it's embedded in the title, is that you have to couple social innovations embodied in policy and in institutional change with new technologies. That there are never successful magic bullets that come just from the scientist's bench. These have to be matched with social change. They have to be matched with policies, with market conditions, with institutions that support the uptake of a new technology and safeguard people against its unintended adverse consequences, because all technological change does have adverse consequences. Joseph Schumpeter famously termed technological change creative destruction. And we have to couple safety nets with methods to facilitate diffusion. You also need bundles because populations are never homogeneous. What will work for one subgroup won't work for another. So you need a portfolio of options to promote transformation that is sustainable and achieves HER's objectives. And finally, as Jo Svinen and Danielle Resnick at IFPRI have a really nice book that came out last year on the political economy of agri-food systems transformation. And one of the central themes of that is the need to build coalitions. You rarely build coalitions off of just one thing. You need a bundle of different interventions that each attract a constituency to be able to put together the coalition to support agri-food systems transformation, which is, after all, a political undertaking. So I want to just briefly talk about three examples I've been involved in. That's why I choose these, because I know something about them, not because they're the best example, but they underscore the socio-technical innovation bundles idea and the capacity to engineer reasonably rapid transformation. So the first example concerns humanitarian response. When disasters hit and people are suddenly struggling to feed their families, how do we respond? For literally centuries, the common response was ship food from surplus areas, the United States in our case, to areas that suddenly are facing a shortfall. And that food aid strategy that prevailed in the United States and Canada and Europe, especially post-World War II, the modern US food aid programs essentially launched in 1954, but they were really slow. The median time from a call forward, from a formal request for food to delivery at port, not distribution in the interior of a country, was about 4.5 months. That's a long time to wait for food. So they're slow, they're inefficient. You lose an awful lot on the way in transport costs and in product spoilage. You are often delivering culturally inappropriate product, yellow maize sent from the United States to white maize consuming populations in Southern Africa as one of the textbook examples. And sometimes they're downright harmful. If you send in too much product or at the wrong time, you can drive market prices down and inadvertently hurt local farming communities. So Dan Maxwell, a professor at Tufts, and I document all of this in a book we published about 20 years ago on the 50th anniversary of the US food aid programs, calling for a suite of reforms in US and global food aid programs. And indeed, in the last 15 years or so, we've seen a dramatic transformation of how the world responds to food emergencies. We've seen the rise of modern early warning systems based off of very careful sentinel site selection on big data and machine learning based modeling of nutrient shortfalls in very specific spatial areas. We've seen the rise of cash-based assistance. Rather than sending in food, just send in cash or a voucher like you see in the graphic in the center that enables people to go to their local markets and just buy through their local commercial market channel, which after all is what they will depend upon when the humanitarian assistance organizations withdraw. And supplementing with novel therapeutic foods like this product plumpy nut, as it's commonly known, a ready-to-use therapeutic food that's essentially a peanut-based paste, a groundnut-based paste loaded with minerals and vitamins. It's shelf-stable. Kids like the taste. This is a product that is literally saving children's lives. So an innovation developed in food science laboratories, developed and sold commercially, now very effective. Humanitarian response to food emergencies today is dramatically different than it was when Dan and I wrote that book 20 years ago. We can change things, but it took innovations in a variety of areas all bundled together to make that change happen and save lives. The second example that I want to talk about is something called index-based livestock insurance that a group of us have been involved in for about 15 years. Catastrophic droughts are the main source, the main driver, the cause of poverty traps among pastoral and agropastoral populations in the Greater Horn of Africa. A group of us have studied for 30 years pastoralists in southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya, and we've got pretty strong evidence from multiple data sets now that droughts are what causes a catastrophic collapse in herd size that drives people into sedentarized poverty and very serious malnutrition, children not getting to school, et cetera. So these poverty traps really are closely tied to drought and to extreme weather events that are unfortunately quite closely caught up with climate change. Moreover, because climate is changing in this area, we see that we're seeing higher rates of extreme events, both high rainfall years, which induce, oddly, flooding in deserts occasionally, to very severe droughts. We had a very severe drought quite recently in this region. So this seems to be worsening. We see by collecting data carefully and unpacking kind of weather conditional herd growth rates that when the weather is good, pastoralists can very reliably grow their herds. When the weather is bad, however, you're going to see herds doing at best holding stable, typically starting to fall back, that you see significant herd loss. And the problem is that when we shift to a different climate, the current climate regime has led to long-term adaptation of pastoralist behavior. They engage in transhuman migration of herds to seek water and forage, and they're able to sustain these herds quite well under current climate. But when the herd size gets too small, they're vulnerable to a shock hitting at the wrong moment, or if the droughts happen too frequently or too severely. And what we do in this paper published a decade ago is just simulate by unpacking these state conditional herd growth functions, simulating what happens if we have more or less frequent drought. If we had less frequent drought, in the bottom graphic, the black line depicts the current state of the system in southern Ethiopia that has this multiple stable state property to it that causes a poverty trap. But if you had less frequent drought, you would rise to the blue line, which I refer to as the West Texas equilibrium. The severe drought is something that happens, but it's sufficiently rare that you can reliably recover and grow back to very large herd sizes and significant wealth held in the form of livestock. Conversely, if drought becomes a more frequent occurrence, you have limited ability to recover and you fall down to the red line depicted here, where a mere doubling of the drought frequency, 250 millimeters a year of rainfall or less, would cause a collapse in the system as we presently know it. So index-based livestock insurance was developed to address this catastrophic drought risk in the face of climate change. Essentially, what we're doing is taking drought risk in the rangelands of East Africa and we're moving it into global capital markets through sales of insurance that are then reinsured by European reinsurers typically, so that this is just part of their portfolio, along with hurricane risk in Miami and earthquake risk in Tokyo and a portfolio of car crash risks from Buenos Aires, so that this becomes a new method of addressing drought, because the old methods of addressing drought just weren't working very well. Post-drought restocking, you give people who've lost animals a cow, it winds up being futile. It doesn't move them back out of that low sedentarized absorbing state. It doesn't break them out of the poverty trap. So it's a futile exercise that has negative rates of return over periods of 5 to 10 years. Food aid, as I've already described, is very slow and expensive. Moreover, because it's site-based distribution, it commonly reinforces sedentarization and localized range degradation. And we have a lot of excess mortality due to bad policy designs that used to be true, that thankfully have been relaxed. Conventional insurance just isn't available for a host of reasons. It's just infeasible to offer conventional insurance where somebody calls the insurance company, says, my cow died. The insurance company comes out, says, yep, your cow's dead, and writes you a check. It just can't happen there. And the core of the problem here is that under these methods we've been using, where we respond only to the poorest people, but the whole system is subject to shocks that drive the presently non-poor but vulnerable into poverty, the system will get overwhelmed in time. We refer to this in a paper led by Nobuo Ikegami as the social protection paradox, that if you focus above all or exclusively on the poorest population, as is natural and indeed ethically appropriate, if you don't also do something to safeguard the vulnerable middle class, if you will, from collapsing into the ranks of the poor, pretty quickly the population needing social protection grows so quickly that it rapidly overwhelms budgets and everybody winds up much worse off. So you need a method of helping people get back to being viable on their own. We need to break the cycle of reinforcing feedback. And that's what building resilience is about. So this IBLI design, this index-based livestock insurance design, I won't go to in detail, but the basic idea was there are 2 rainy seasons in this area. So you sell a contract before the usual rains begin. The contract will pay out if the satellite-based measures of rangeland productivity, so normalized difference vegetation index, if that predicts that herd losses on average in this area would be 15% or greater, then people who hold a policy get a payout. And that payout has been advanced such that you can now use it to buy supplemental feed or to be able to truck in water or move animals to where there is water, move animals by lorry to where there is water, so that you can protect the assets, keep the animals from dying, rather than only reimburse people after mortality for their loss of wealth. So the idea is that index-based insurance takes some of that drought risk, it pushes it out of the system, provides poor pastoralists with financing that they can use to either restock or to move into other areas. And this is an imperfect product. It does not work perfectly, but it does work largely as we designed it to. And careful evaluation evidence shows that it has really high impacts on income, on a measure of severe acute malnutrition among kids, mid-upper arm circumference. The marginal benefit cost ratio of IBLI compared to cash transfers was an order of magnitude larger. And this has sparked a big scale out where this is supported by improved rangelands management and conflict avoidance, peace committees, and improved outreach of schooling and healthcare, veterinary and human, in these communities as a bundle to help to support pastoralists who are facing these drought risks. And this is scaled out now across Kenya as the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program supported by the government. It's now in Ethiopia and Djibouti and Somalia and Zambia. It's in a range of countries, but the whole idea was building resilience to drought. The final example I'd like to talk about with my colleague Jason Rohr, who I mentioned earlier at Notre Dame, is on how one can how one can break a vicious cycle of agricultural development, in particular fertilizer use, where fertilizer runs off into waterways, feeds aquatic vegetation growth. The aquatic vegetation provides a natural habitat for a snail that is the vector for schistosomiasis. And so we're seeing this very high rate of schistosomiasis infection that has been rising in the Senegal River Valley of northern Senegal. We see that schistosomiasis is an extremely widespread disease. It doesn't kill huge numbers of people, so it doesn't get the attention malaria does, for example, but it affects roughly 250 million people any given year, all in poor rural communities. And it's a really good example of a poverty disease trap where people get sick, Because they are sick, they can't work as well. Children wind up not going to school. The disease itself causes problems that increase the risk of anemia, causes cognitive loss. Kids don't go to school. So incomes fall, families are less productive, they're less likely to be able to afford to access clean water. So they go back into dirty water and the infection cycle begins again. They're also, their immunoresponse system is suppressed by schisto. Deworming is the usual strategy here, but deworming is a curative treatment. It's a treatment of the manifestation of the disease. It's not a systemic approach to eradicating the disease from communities. So reinfection rates in these communities we study in northern Senegal are north of 90%. Kids get dewormed, 2 years later, they've all gotten schistosomiasis again. We've tried controls, biocontrols, like prawns that will predate the snails and thereby wipe out some of the schistosomes. That has largely proved ineffective for a variety of reasons. Works a few places, it's not broadly effective. So Jason's insight was, why don't we clear out the vegetation that is the habitat? So there's one very specific species, Ceratophyllum demersum, that the snails like, the snails that vector schisto are almost entirely on or very near those plants. That is their preferred habitat. So if you simply remove that habitat in the vicinity of where people enter the water to wash clothes, wash dishes, go fishing, etc., because the cercariae, the juvenile worms emitted from the snail that infect people, don't live long and don't travel far, you don't need to clear the entire water body. You just need to clear the area around where people enter. And we ran a randomized controlled trial in this area, which we reported last summer in an article in Nature. And this really works. You knock down you intentionally knock down the vegetative growth that knocks down the snail population. It sharply reduces infection rates. Moreover, the biomass that you harvest from clearing this vegetation out is really effective compost. You're basically recapturing the fertilizer that was applied someplace up slope that washed down into the waterway, got absorbed by, taken up by, and turned into a fairly rich source of nutrients in this Cerato. You compost that and it has very high private benefit cost returns in the form of boosted agricultural productivity. Also works very well as low-cost livestock feed. And once you count in the public health spillover benefits of reduced infection rates, you get really high returns on investments in clearing that. So the point is, we can come up with innovations that can address these problems, these shocks that come from disease or from drought or other things. And there's a host of innovations on the way, things that are really exciting. Biofortified crops that can help boost micronutrient access for the poor. There's a new study out right now about being able to culture beef tissue on rice cells as scaffolding so that you basically get a hybrid meat with rice that can boost both fat and protein intake for people who can really only get access to rice. These technologies of being able to load up the staple crops of the poor with the nutrients they need for healthier living, these technologies are coming along really quickly. But they have to be supported by a range of policies and by extension, and they have to be affordable. Stress-resistant crops, a picture of Pam Ronald here, who's developed flood-resistant rice that is really effective at helping coastal areas in particular cope with increased flooding with climate change, preserving the growth potential of the rice on which communities depend. There are analogs for drought resistance and heat resistance and pest resistance. Breeders are doing some amazing things, and genetic change in crops and livestock have been the bedrock of most progress in agri-food systems throughout, well, 10,000 years, basically. Once humans began to domesticate wild species, that has enabled progress in food supply and in human civilization. We're seeing changes in livestock feed and food feed competition, lots of clever approaches to upcycling waste, from recapturing human waste to use as fertilizer, to use as feedstock for black soldier flies, larvae of which become feed for livestock. recapturing the phosphorus that's in bones of slaughtered animals so that you can use this in place of triple superphosphate, get rid of the bones and the carcasses in the local tip, and instead create useful fertilizer for local farmers. There are a host of these sorts of innovations on their way. And this is a very exciting time, and new genomic techniques are only making this much more likely and accelerating the rate at which we can make breakthroughs, especially genetic-based breakthroughs. But the technologies aren't the only thing, and especially not on-farm technologies, because one of the big challenges is we have to actually reduce our pressure on the land and on water, not expand it. So decoupling the added food production needed to satisfy the demand of growing populations and populations with higher income that typically demand more meat that requires much more land, or more animal source foods in general that require much more land. They want more fruits and vegetables that require much more water. We have to decouple this additional food production from land and water, and that is growing feasible through 3D printing using recovered waste, through controlled environment agriculture, through cultivated products and plant-based proteins. These are not all economically viable yet, and some of them will prove not economically viable in the long run, but some of them will. And we really need to be pushing more on developing these with the food safety protections, with regulatory oversight in particular, so that this doesn't just become highly profitable IP for private companies, that this is widely available above all in the global South. And a lot of this is going to get driven by companies operating in the midstream, not by farmers or by you and I as consumers, but by profit-seeking firms that are looking to reduce their risk exposure, including reputational risk exposure. And this is going to require stakeholder pressure. Those of us who are investors or consumers or who have connections to companies, pressuring leadership on doing the right thing here, and pressuring political leadership on appropriate regulation. Things like food form reformulation and fortification by manufacturers. This is happening. The question is, what directions will it take? Will we guide the transformation that companies are going to be pushing on food producers in the coming generation? Are we going to guide that in directions that promote HERS agri-food transformation, that promote health, equity, resilience, and sustainability? And this can happen very quickly. The lesson of rennet, to me, is very telling. For those unaware, rennet is an enzyme that comes out of originally the lining of calves and used for making cheese. Well, as cheese demand grew, being able to supply increased rennet required raising more calves for slaughter, which both is economically challenging, but also it began to run afoul of animal welfare interests. Scientists developed a synthetic rennet, a genetically engineered form of rennet that now occupies roughly 97% of the rennet market in the United States. Most people don't even know that transformation happened. It happened in the background because manufacturers and processors looking for low-cost, scalable inputs found a good technology solution. It was coupled with good food safety regulation and standardization of the production methods with open source synthetic biology, and this really changed things quite quickly. We can do this. This can also enable us to transform rural communities that are struggling. I've been to East Lansing a number of times. There are a lot of communities not far from you that really are struggling. Just like I live in a small town just north of Ithaca that up until about 5-6 years ago had more cows than people, and farmers here are struggling. They need livelihood opportunities in these small rural communities. And we have options emerging for farming carbon and solar and wind power and providing wildlife conservation services for society that can diversify income streams for rural communities. And the increasingly idle manufacturing capacity in small towns and small cities is really useful as low cost controlled environment agricultural facilities. So we really need to be thinking of how do we partner to build rural community viability, rural community resilience to the changes that are coming from technologies as well as climate and market shocks. How do we do this together through a bundle of technologies and policies? So ultimately, while I talk about polycrises, the many multiple linked crises that all trace back to agri-food systems, I'm ultimately very optimistic. We can build human and environmental resilience to shocks, even in low-income rural communities like the ones where I work. This Madagascar community with a locust infestation you can see flying over the rice fields. But it requires this doubly progressive strategy. It requires a renewed commitment to innovation, both in technologies and in institutions and policies. We are not going to fix 21st century problems with 20th century methods. We need to shift from calories and yields as the focus in agri-food systems innovation to HERS indicators, healthy, equitable, resilient, sustainable methods of production, processing, and consumption. We need to pay a lot more attention to the midstream actors that ultimately drive an awful lot of both upstream farmer behavior and downstream consumer behavior, as well as to non-farm options for sourcing an increasing share of our food to meet future food demand growth. And all of this has to be coupled with effective, efficient, responsive social protection and enhanced risk management because technological change and innovation are creative destruction. We have to engage in social protection. Otherwise, people will rightly be worried that they are going to get kicked to the curb by progress others enjoy, and they will resist. So bringing everybody along requires having social protection hand in hand with technological innovation. So I thank you for this opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I welcome your thoughts and your comments. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Barrett, for your really fantastic lecture. And it's very stimulating and insightful. Now it's time for questions. And the audience, again, is welcome to put a question in the Q&A box. I already see the question in the box already from Felicia Wu. She said, "Please, thank you for this terrific presentation. I have wondered about the scientific revolution and why social political consideration seems more important now than in the past." She gave examples like Green Revolution from 1940s to 1970s and global smallpox eradication in the 60s and 70s. She said, why in these cases, the science drove huge global public health and economic benefits without a great deal of social political pushback. Is something different now? Would we not have this type of science-driven revolution again for agri-food system for resilience? I have thought for decades regarding biotech, but other examples are also available. So thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Felicia. That is an incredibly insightful comment. I appreciate it. You know, I often point to iodized salt as one of the best possible examples because go back 100 years, indeed, I think it was in Michigan, if my memory serves me right, that public health professionals first established the connection between iodine deficiency and goiter. You know, 100 years ago, the leading cause of mental retardation in humans was iodine deficiency. People weren't taking in enough iodine, largely because we as humans had migrated away from our evolutionary origins near salt water, where the iodine in salt water was a staple part of our diet because we were consuming foods that came from the oceans. But as we migrated inland to areas quite distant from oceans, we were increasingly relying on terrestrial mammals and plants that just didn't have iodine content. And so iodine deficiency became very widespread. But it's incredibly easy to fix. It doesn't cost much money at all to add iodine to salt. In manufactured salt, you get this very significant response. One of the first studies I did as a new professor at Utah State University in the mid-90s was in the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco on iodine deficiency, where we found more than 90% of kids were suffering measurable iodine deficiency measured through urine content, but a very large share also had visible goiters. And the problem was that they weren't getting iodized salt. The United States, interestingly, doesn't require, we do not by law require salt manufacturers to iodize their salt, but it has become standard practice. So the industry as a whole does this voluntarily, but many other countries have mandated that commercial manufacturers of salt must iodize. They must fortify salt with iodine. And that has largely eradicated severe iodine deficiency disorder through most populations. As you say, folic acid supplementation in vegetable oils, et cetera, to similar things. This is exactly the sort of point I was trying to make about the importance of the midstream. Those are not farmer level innovations. These are innovations in the manufacturing and processing stages. And in those stages, companies are paying attention to profits. They're paying attention to their reputational risk. This is where stakeholder pressure and political pressure, writing congressmen, can make a real difference. Why is it that we're not seeing that same sort of progress? Well, I think we are actually. Genetically engineered transgenic crop varieties diffused globally faster than any prior new crop varieties did. We're seeing rapid diffusion. What we're aware of is because global communications make protest much more easy to register and to project further distance, protest gets added voice. And so we become more aware of those who will resist, some of whom are resisting for good reason. They stand to lose. Some of whom resist for purely ideological reasons, often somewhat demagogical reasons. But the progress here really depends upon those who are going to think carefully, which is one of the reasons why I think we can use the midstream. We food consumers think fast. We make, on average in the United States, 200 plus food related decisions a day. You simply can't think carefully about every one of those decisions. So we make instinctual, knee-jerk decisions, what the psychologist Danny Kahneman refers to as fast thinking. Business leaders have to do slow thinking. They have to sit down and think about what is the best strategy, what is going to generate shareholder returns that will keep us in our jobs as well-paid executives. And we can play to the slow thinking of the midstream leadership, along with that of political leaders, to help to engineer transformation like that of iodized salt, like that of the rennet transformation in cheese manufacturing. But the key becomes helping to build the evidence so that those who will sit down and think slowly and carefully, not just react to whatever the latest post on TikTok or Instagram is, we need to focus on those who are prone to slow thinking, rational slow thinking, and we need to help to flag the errors of those who are promoting knee-jerk reactions in fast thinking mode. So I think science can help here, but we have to target the right audiences.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this insightful response. And we have another question here from Vicky. She said, "Thanks so much. Very enlightening. Can you share a bit more of how removal of plant supplemental plant species impact the Shishido snails?"
Yeah, so Vicky, take a look at Nature in July of 2023. Jason Rohr, ROHR, is the lead author. Quite a few of us co-authors. Look at the Nature et al., the Rohr et al. Paper in Nature in July of 2023. That documents all of this. And if you look at Jason's website, he has a range of other related papers around schisto and the plant community that supports it.
Great. Next one from Sarah Delaney from University of Maine. She said I like and agree with the switching to herbs, the indicators, but those are harder to measure than yield. How much progress have you and collaborators made on suggesting practical way to measure sustainability, resilience, and others?
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great observation. I completely agree with you. You know, there's an old joke about economists being like drunk people looking for their keys after they've left the bar, you know, leaning up against the lamppost, looking on the ground, and a well-meaning stranger comes by and says, "Are you looking for something?" And the drunk guy says, "Yeah, my keys." And the bystander says, "Well, did you lose them here?" And the drunk guy says, "No, I lost them back there in the dark, but the light is so much better here." And we economists are often accused of looking at the simple to see indicators and ignoring where the real problems are. And this is true of yields. Yields are very simple to compute. Calories are harder to compute, but still comparatively simple, especially compared to trace nutrients, zinc or selenium or such. Um, we are making progress, but we're not there yet. And this is a really important area of research. What are low cost verifiable measurement methods? So traceability that is so important to any labeling, anything you're trying to get consumers to invest in based off of product attributes they can't directly verify themselves. You know, labeling depends upon there being low cost verifiable information. We're making progress with things like remote sensing that can help us to identify whether there really is deforestation happening in the area in which this product was produced. We're making progress on being able to test at lower cost on nutrient content of products. We are developing better methods for identifying poverty impacts, but we still have a long ways to travel. Resilience in particular is very difficult measurement domain. There are significant controversies about this. A group of us wrote an article in World Development in 2021 surveying the evidence on development resilience and documenting how little reconciliation of methods there is and how little consistency there is across methods and what conclusions one reaches from the same data set even. So this is an area that will be very important to research. It's not just direct on innovations, it's on the indicators we track. There's a really nice food systems dashboard that Jess Fanzo at Columbia and colleagues run that tries to start assembling these data. And Jess would be the first one to tell you that they don't have great indicators for lots of things, and they don't have nearly the country and year coverage that they would like. But this is a really important step in the right direction because we manage to what we measure. And if we don't start measuring HERS indicators, we certainly aren't going to manage our progress in that direction. We're going to continue to target yields. And so I applaud those who are working hard on developing better indicators.
Great, thank you so much. The next question from Valerie Martin. She said, thank you for your presentation. I'm an ecologist and interested in working for the USDA after my PhD. Do you collaborate with the USDA scientists and policymakers? What do you think the role of USDA for protecting American farmers and supporting these innovations?
Yeah, so USDA is really important. I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from, again, the history of what happened in US and Canadian agri-food systems in the 1930s through 60s, where USDA played a really crucial role. USDA has got gutted for a while, and it's really nice to see the recovery. My group does work with USDA on especially food assistance programs and food security in the United States. My group's focus is primarily in low and lower middle income countries, so we don't work with USDA as much there because it doesn't have that much of a presence. But a lot of the new initiatives that are really exciting around things like how can we effectively measure carbon in soils, these are going to come from US applications originally. I have a number of colleagues here on campus at Cornell working very closely with USDA scientists on digital agriculture, for example, for attending to some of these measurement questions, as well as for improving response to shocks. USDA and other research agencies around the world, their compatriot National Ag Research and Extension Systems are really centerpieces of making progress.
Great, thank you. Next question from Sada Bardari. how can the agroforestry system in agriculture help with the food security or to achieve sustainability?
So agroforestry, for those not unfamiliar with the term, meaning planting woody species in agricultural land, otherwise agricultural landscapes. So some of this is what Pedro Sanchez, a World Food Prize laureate, used to refer to as fertilizer trees, like trees that will fix atmospheric nitrogen, or ones that provide good browsing for livestock that you can let go through the fields prior to planting, where they will deposit manure on the field, so accelerating nutrient cycling into the soils, protecting against pests. These are pretty well established as effective supplements to advances in genetic improvement in staple crops and in fruits and vegetables. They aren't going to be the whole solution, but they are a really important part of the solution. These integrated landscapes that improve nutrient cycling are going to be very important going forward, especially in smallholder agricultural systems in the global south.
Great, thank you so much. Another one from anonymous attendee. They say, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I was curious about your thoughts about the human-wildlife conflict related to food insecurity, especially for global south.
I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to in human wildlife conflict. I'm imagining it might be things like human elephant conflict as cultivated lands in East Africa and Southern Africa have expanded into wildlife migration corridors. I mean, the best answers to this seem to be around maintaining effective protected areas and migratory corridors for wildlife. The other conflict is when humans just directly go into wild spaces. You know, when we're going into forests, we're going directly into the homes of wildlife. We necessarily come into conflict with them. And the main reasons for that are that people don't have affordable access to food. I've spent a lot of time in places where people go into forests and jungles to go try to harvest food for themselves. Very few think that that's, you know, their preferred lifestyle. They do this because they don't have better options. Making healthy food available more broadly and affordably, social protection schemes that ensure the rural poor have access to healthy food that they can afford to give their families, will often take the pressure off wild spaces. That will in turn pay off for us in reduced zoonoses. We'll introduce fewer diseases and we'll introduce them more slowly.
Yeah, great. We already run out of time, but there's still some questions. Do you have time to answer those questions, or we can stop here?
I've got a couple minutes if you want to
Okay.
keep going.
Okay, great. So the next question, also from anonymous attendee, said you ignored the many other resources such as soil and water that are essential but not resolved by plant modification. Also, I think the herds, right, probably herds goals are not supported legally and require both consumer engagement and economic benefit. The reality is that the companies must save their shareholders. This is seems ignorant of the real impact externality. Relying on the middle removes sovereignty of people. How does that save the authentic herds goal? Probably the what you talk about, the healthy and equitable and resilient and sustainable goals. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I follow everything. I think there's a lot of richness behind this short comment that I can't fully follow. But I think part of the essence is you're worried that I'm naive about hoping we can change company behavior. Let me put it differently. If we don't change company behavior, all is lost. If we just rely upon food manufacturers, food processors, food retailers, the life sciences companies that produce agrochemicals and modern seed, if we rely upon them under their current incentive structure, we will not make progress. So you have to change their behaviors. And the question is, how are you going to do that? I think it wildly naive to believe that companies are just going to collapse and individuals are going to rise up in some grand collective. That's never happened effectively at any scale in history. And politically, it's highly unlikely. The question is, how are you going to get you and me and workers who have an interest that isn't coincident with that of the shareholders in Kellogg's or the shareholders in Syngenta or in Walmart? How are you going to get us to be able to collectively exert enough influence over policymakers, over shareholders, that they will change their incentives? And this is where elections matter. Electing political leaders who are willing to hold corporate leaders to account, having effective regulatory agencies that don't get gutted, are really important to putting up safeguards, to making sure that companies have the right incentives and that they're constrained in their most egregious behaviors. Personally, I think one of the real tragedies of the last 40 years in the United States and Europe is essentially government walking away from antitrust enforcement against companies. Market power has become so prevalent, and it leads to lots of really bad behavior. We've got to find effective ways of providing carrots and sticks that get companies to do the right thing. Trying to do it without companies, I think, is wildly naive.
Well, thank you so much. So one last question here is from Baba Toby. She said very enlightening talk. Please share more light on how agro-food systems are a common denominator for today's poly crisis.
Good to hear from you, Baba Tope. Thanks for tuning in. So let me just give you a quick example. I'm heading off this weekend to a week-long event with 20 members of the U.S. Congress discussing U.S. interests in Africa. And I was asked to be kind of the expert participating in this dialogue around agriculture, food, and nutrition. So I'm trying to make the case to a group of congressmen, some of whom aren't intrinsically interested in African food security. Why should they care? So one reason they should care is that rising insecurity, contestation over land grabs in Africa lead to government overthrow. Government overthrow is a direct problem for the United States. We have a surprisingly large military presence in sub-Saharan Africa that has been growing as we've seen more sociopolitical instability, especially in the Sahel. You're going to help reduce sociopolitical instability by improving local agricultural productivity. You're not going to feed Africa from the US Midwest. That's crazy talk. So roughly 75% of the food consumed in the world was grown in the country in which it's eaten. Africa is going to be the locus of most food demand growth over the coming couple of generations. You simply have to boost food production in Africa. And if you don't, you will see rising food prices in Africa, and you will see rising contestation over land and water in Africa. And when that happens, you're going to see groups that are hostile to US global interests taking over in places. That's going to cost you a lot more in military intervention and in military preparedness than it does to invest in agricultural development for sub-Saharan Africa. So I try to make the case that this is in your interest, even if you don't care about whether African kids eat well, if you only care about how many young American men and women are you going to put in harm's way. I say this as a former Army officer and the father of a Navy officer, by the way, that if your interest is purely geopolitical and military, you should also care about food systems and places like Africa. I'm happy to talk more with you offline about this, Baba Tope, if you're interested.
Well, that's great. We already 8 minutes past the hour, so thank you so much, Professor Barrett, and for your really terrific lecture again. And thanks to the audience for this active participation. And so goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day or evening, depending where you are. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks so much for having me, Jack. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.